It is dawn on the 25th of April. As the sun begins to rise, the haunting sound of a bagpipe is heard. A crowd is gathered around a war memorial, and as the lone piper plays a lament to the fallen, people come and lay wreaths and flowers at the foot of the memorial. Similar scenes are happening in many communities across Australia and New Zealand. In some of these communities there's a handful of people, and in others there's thousands or tens of thousands of people. G'day, my name's Keith and this is the Digger History Podcast. In this episode I'll be talking about bagpipes at war, and in particular the connection with the Australian Army. Now you might be thinking, hey, this is a pretty specific topic to be talking about in a military history podcast, quite a niche subject, and the reason I'm talking about this subject is quite close to me because I myself am a bagpipe player. And this Anzac Day, as I have done in many years previously, I will be one of those lone pipers playing a lament at a dawn service somewhere around Australia. Now, before we get into the whole connection of bagpipes in the Australian Army and how bagpipes became so strongly connected with our military, I just want to talk a little bit about the bagpipe itself. So when you think of bagpipes, most people think of a Scottish instrument, and the bagpipe that we commonly think about is actually called the Great Highland bagpipe. So that's a traditional Scottish bagpipe we generally think about when we talk about bagpipes. Bagpipes, however, weren't invented in Scotland. It's unclear where they actually came from, but there are thoughts that they may have come from Greece or the Middle East and evolved from like chanter-like instruments, where someone's come up with a bright idea that if they added a bag to this chanter, they could continue to play while they took a breath. So as I said, there's hundreds of different types of bagpipes around the world, but the most common one that we think of when we talk bagpipes is the Great Highland bagpipe, and so that's the one I will be referring to today when we talk about bagpipes at war and the bagpipes in the Australian Army. Now a point of interest, the bagpipe is the only musical instrument that has ever been classified as a weapon of war. So how does a musical instrument be classified as a weapon? You're probably asking. Well, this goes back to the Jacobite uprisings of 1745 in the Scottish Highlanders. Correction, Scottish Highlands, not Highlanders. So at the Battle of Culloden of 1746, several bagpipers were involved in the battle, and James Reed was one of these pipers, and he was captured by the English and taken to England and put on trial for treason. Now, usually a musician would be classed as a non-combatant, so that they aren't treated as a combative soldier. However, during the trial, it was decided that since Scottish Highland regiments never march without a piper, then a bagpipe, in the eyes of the law, must be a weapon. So Reed was found guilty for treason and hanged. Now, as is the case with a lot of archaic laws that still remain in the system and don't get changed, this law actually remained until 1996 when it was eventually repealed. So for over 200 years the bagpipe was legally classed as a weapon. The Great Highland bagpipe spread throughout the British Empire, so countries like Canada, New Zealand and Australia adopted the bagpipe quite readily, with a lot of Scottish migrants coming to these countries. And if you're along the east coast of Australia, from like northern New South Wales to southern Queensland, there's a lot of Scottish towns, like Byron Bay and Maclean and places like that have a rich Scottish heritage. And then in New Zealand you have like around the Otago area, around Dunedin, and even down south in around Invercargill, it's rich Scottish heritage there. In fact, another point of interest is New Zealand actually has the most number of pipe bands per capita than any country in the world. But let's get back on track here, back into the military side of things. I'm digressing here and turning this into a podcast about bagpipes. So let's get back on track and start talking about the military use of bagpipes. So in World War One, around 2,500 pipers served with the British Army, and out of them 500 were killed and another 600 were wounded. So nearly half of them became casualties. Pipers served on the Western Front, and they would often play to inspire the troops going over the top into the trenches, and they'd come out of the trenches unarmed except for their bagpipe, and they'd play and amongst machine gun fire and like it was really unimaginable to think that you would just get out of a trench with a bagpipe and start playing as you're being shot at with machine guns and rifle fire and artillery. But that's what they did. And there were actually 2 Victoria Crosses won by pipers in the First World War. One of these was a piper, Daniel Laidlaw, a Scotsman who won his Victoria Cross in the Battle of Lewes in 1915. It was actually one of the first battles where gas was used on the Western Front, and the gas was actually fired by the British, meant to go to gas the Germans, and the wind actually blew it back on the British, and Piper Laidlaw saw his company was shaken by the effects of the gas, and he mounted the parapet and marched up and down playing the bagpipes, and he kept playing until he was wounded, shot in both legs, and then they managed to make it back to his trenches. And for any budding pipers out there not wanting to know what the tune he played was, the tune was Blue Bonnets Over the Border. Now the second piper to receive the Victoria Cross in World War One was a Canadian by the name of James Richardson. Now Richardson was part of the 1st Canadian Division at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Now during an attack, Richardson's battalion was pinned down by intense enemy fire and barbed wire, and Richardson, who was like 20 at the time, played his bagpipes to encourage the men forward. he marched up and down playing the bagpipes in the face of enemy fire, inspiring his mates to continue with the attack, and the attack was successful. The only trouble was when they withdrew, James left his bagpipes behind, so he had to go back to get his bagpipes near the front lines. So off he went to recover the bagpipes, and then he never returned. So it was presumed that he was killed. Now, interestingly enough, these pipes were thought to have been buried in the mud in the battlefield, but they were a set of bagpipes were actually found by a British Army chaplain in 1917. So he brought them back to Scotland, and they were actually found by the pipe major of the Canadian Scottish Regiment about 90 years later, and did some research, and they believed that these pipes actually belonged to James Richardson. Another Canadian piper by the name of George Paul actually posthumously received the military medal for playing the bagpipes on top of a tank at the Battle of Amiens. So there's a lot of there's a big list of famous Canadian pipers in the First World War. The Canadians actually had about 1,000 pipers as casualties in the First World War, and about half of them, 500, were fatal. So about 500 Canadian pipers were killed in the First World War. So now let's get back to the Australians, as this is the Digger History Podcast, and Diggers are Australian, so it's mainly about Australian, though I do enjoy researching like some Canadian military history and New Zealand military history, but getting back to Australia, as I mentioned before, the whole northern New South Wales area and southeast Queensland, there's a lot of Scottish heritage in those areas, and there still is, and the militia units around there were picked up on this Scottish heritage. So the 42nd Battalion, which is raised at Enoggera in Brisbane, it was called the Australian Black Watch Regiment, and it had its own pipe band. And the 41st Infantry Battalion, it was raised also in Queensland, in southeast Queensland, but it was from people from southeast Queensland and northern rivers area of New South Wales, so that it was steeped in Scottish heritage too, and it was actually the Byron Scottish Battalion, and they still keep that heritage today. The local Army Reserve Unit in northern New South Wales, the 41st Battalion, picks up all that tradition of the 41st Battalion AIF, and the Kiwis too. They had pipe bands attached to their regiments. So in the First World War, the Auckland, Canterbury, and Otago regiments all had pipe bands, and a lot of the pipers also they doubled as stretcher bearers. So musicians traditionally in the British tradition also doubled as stretcher bearers. Now, as you can probably imagine, the trouble with playing a bagpipe in combat is you're kind of a big target, and not surprisingly, combat losses were for bagpipers were high. As I said before, like of the 2,500 pipers that served in the British Army in World War One. 500 were killed, and another 600 were casualties. So yeah. Look, this was putting yourself out there unarmed to play bagpipes in facing the enemy fire was pretty crazy stuff. So in World War Two, in the Second Battle of El Alamein in 1943, it was actually stopped. Like the frontline role for a bagpiper was prohibited, and pipers were no longer allowed to go into battle playing bagpipes. This didn't stop some. However, there were some that continued to do this. Particularly in the D-Day landings, there's a few stories of famous pipers that went into D-Day landings playing bagpipes. So even though it was ruled out, there were obviously people that still continued to do it. So when researching this, I was looking for particular stories about Australian pipers, and I did find one, a bloke by the name of Terence Rigney, who was from Burnie in Tasmania, just on the north coast of Tasmania there, and he was a tailor, and he actually became like the unofficial piper. So from a lot of stories I've read about Australian pipers, that they kind of become unofficial pipers in their military units. Their main job isn't a bagpiper, but they actually take their bagpipes with them and become the unofficial piper. So and that's what Terence Rigney did. He actually did. He did take his bagpipes to Kokoda, which I'm quite intrigued by this. Bagpipes aren't exactly a small instrument to take anywhere. It's not like a harmonica that you can just slip into your pocket. It's not a easy task transporting your bagpipes around. I can imagine like the rugged conditions of Kokoda, trying to keep your bagpipes in good condition in the jungle. It's would be quite a task. But Terence took his bagpipes to Kokoda, and he used to play them for the Papuan troops, and there was a story he recounts. One of a Papuan chief actually offered to swap Terence one of his wives for his bagpipes, but he declined the swap. But though I haven't found a lot in the way of articles on specifically on Australian pipers during the war, I have found a few pictures in the Australian War Memorial archives, and one is of four pipers, Australian pipers. Now these guys are wearing shorts and slouch hats, and it's in the Middle East. It doesn't say exactly where. It doesn't say who the pipers are, and it doesn't say where or when. So in the Middle East, 1941 in the Middle East. I wouldn't like to guess. It doesn't really say 1941, so there was a lot going on with the Australians in the Middle East in 1941. It could have been a number of places. But going by how these blokes are dressed, just in normal service uniforms with shorts and slouch hats, it doesn't look like they were official pipers. They were probably just once again soldiers that took their bagpipes to war with them, and formed like a unofficial band, it looks like. There's also quite a few photos on the AWM archives of Australians playing bagpipes in Vietnam. So there's one it's quite intriguing. There's a private Phil Cheeseman of Redcliffe in Queensland, which is interesting because I actually grew up in Redcliffe. So he's playing bagpipes for a Korean sailor, and the sailor looks quite fascinated by these bagpipes. And then there's another famous one. I'm just looking it up now. It's of the Battle of Long Tan, or after the Battle of Long Tan, a memorial, and there's two pipers. And I remember seeing this one a while ago. I've just looked it up now, and it is there's a group of soldiers at the Long Tan cross in South Vietnam, and there's two pipers there, and the names of the pipers are Corporal David Newland of Western Australia and Corporal Gordon Black of New South Wales. So this was a service that was held in honour of those that died in the Battle of Long Tan. Now just looking at the way these men are dressed and their bagpipes, I would imagine these are also soldiers who have taken their bagpipes with them to war, as opposed to official bagpipers. So, as I said, look, taking your bagpipes to war, I find quite fascinating because they're big instruments. They take a lot of room in luggage. Trying to take bagpipes on an aircraft with you is quite a task. So imagine carrying them around with you in a battle zone. It's quite intriguing, I find. Now there's also stories about bagpipers and pipe bands in POW camps, especially during the Second World War, and Stalag 383. That's it had quite a big pipe band, and that's quite fascinating too. Like how you keep your bagpipes like well maintained, like in a prisoner of war environment. Bagpipe parts aren't easy to come by, so some of these pipers must have been pretty resourceful to be able to create their own reeds and do their own repairs and bags. There's one story of a piper in a Japanese prison camp who actually got an animal carcass from the kitchen because his pipe bag had worn away, so he created his own out of this an animal carcass that he pilfered from the kitchen. So quite resourceful, quite like amazing stuff to think about. So there you go. There's a bit of a story about pipers at war, and I hope you got something out of it. Whether you love or hate bagpipes, it's quite fascinating, the story of some bagpipers at war and the things that they endured and went through. And look nowadays, bagpipes are more of a ceremonial thing in the army and in the defence forces, playing on occasions such as Anzac Day, Remembrance Day, as well as parades, which is look, if you ask me, there's nothing like a pipe band marching troops. Is the most amazing thing to see and hear, but that's me. Some people hate bagpipes, and I know in my time as as a piper, I've heard all the jokes about cats and everything. So if you want to put cat jokes in the comments, believe me, I've heard them all before. But for me, it's an amazing honour to be the lone piper on an Anzac Day dawn service. It's just absolutely amazing thing to do, and look, I love playing that small role in such a solemn event, and the tune that I usually play at these events, it's called Flowers of the Forest. It's an ancient Scottish tune. It's traditionally there's other laments that are sometimes played, but you'll often hear Flowers of the Forest being played. This tune goes back to about the 1600s, and they were written to commemorate the battle of Flodden in 1513. So it's very a solemn tune, and it's considered it should only be played at a funeral or a memorial service. It's considered like disrespectful to play at any other occasion. Some pipers will even go as far as to say it should never be played indoors because it's inviting like the spirits inside. But so it's very considered a very solemn tune. There are other laments that are often played on Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, but Flowers of the Forest is probably the most common one. And usually this is done by a lone piper. However, like if there's lots and lots of wreaths to be laid, so on a big service you might have like pipers that are all like tag teams. So when one will be ready to play, so another one stops and the next one carries on. If there's lots and lots of wreaths to be laid. Sorry. So there you go. A little bit about bagpipes, a little bit about bagpipes as used in the army and in war. I hope you do enjoy this episode, and look, if you have any suggestions for episodes, please feel free to put them in the comments. I love researching military history, so this is kind of a bit of a I guess a hobby for me, like to go in and research these things in order to make a podcast about it. So I learn a bit from these things as well. So it's feel free to pop in the comments any suggestions that you might have on what you want to hear about next in Digger history. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.